everyone. I'm Marilyn, CEO and founder of Cosmic Centaurs, and your host for today's session of the third edition of the annual Cosmic Conference, all about the employee experience. To better understand how we can design great employee experiences, we have been exploring for the last 2 weeks and are going into our third and last week of the conference this topic through a variety of lenses. We've talked about internal comms, about engagement, about workplaces, about imprintable moments, culture, values, human connection, organizational strategy, office design, you name it, we've talked about it. And like I said, until October 21st, I will continue to be joined by some incredible people, academics, managers, leaders, experts, who are going to share their insights and experiences with us as we continue to learn all about the employee experience. All of this information is available on our website, which we will link for you in the comments. Before we begin, if you're joining us from Australia, which would make it your afternoon, from the UAE or the GCC or Europe, which would make it your morning, or from the US, which probably means you're watching this on replay, give this video a like, share it with someone who you think might enjoy it. And of course, if you happen to be around, share your thoughts in the comments, ask questions, ask them later. Augustine and I will always come back and answer them together. Today's guest is, I think, a third-time guest, right, Augustine? I think this is the third time we do this.
Yes, it is second or third. Yes,
Yeah, we did the Metaverse webinar, and you were also
yes.
on last year's conference. And Augustine and I met in the pandemic. We've never met in person, but we've been having this very long, 2-year long conversation that hopefully will continue.
It's been great.
Yeah, and so today we will be having this conversation live in front of all of you. Let me introduce Dr. Agustin Chevez is an architect and academic. He's dedicated his career to understanding the notion of work and uncovering environments that best support our working lives. His interest in the relationship between people, space, and technology saw him pursue a PhD on the evolution of workplace architecture as a consequence of technology development. His work has been presented at various international forums and publications. He is an adjunct research fellow at the Center for Design Innovation, Swinburne University, and an honorary fellow at the School of Management and Marketing at the University of Melbourne. Augustine, thanks again for joining me today. I am extra excited because I got to be a witness to part of this journey as you were working on, editing and publishing your book, The Pilgrim's Guide to the Workplace. In fact, what happened is that you walked in isolation for 42 days from Melbourne to Sydney to incubate a unique idea about workplace design. And a million steps later, or more than a million steps later, your pilgrimage delivered unique insights, which you refer to as signposts, named for their promise to point to a better place to work for both organizations and the people who inhabit them. In this session, you and I will try to retrace some of these steps and take a journey, and get you to share with us a few of the things that you learned on that walk and that expedition to lead hopefully to better workplaces and a better vision of work and ourselves. Are you ready to tell us all about this amazing journey?
I'm ready.
All right. Okay, we have to ask because, of course, let's start with the practical stuff. Tell us about the process of writing this book. Why did you choose to go on a 42-day walk? What happened that put this idea in your mind?
The reason why it's a bit long, but it's best explained in the book. But at the end of the day, what I wanted to explore is the value of isolation in creative innovation. So as a workplace designer, a lot of my work is about, or it used to be, about collaboration, getting people together, that if different people from different teams interact or collaborate with each other, innovation will happen. A thing that I mentioned in the book, an experience made me reassess that, because I came through a piece of work that suggests that it's actually isolation that gave us uniqueness and diversity. So I thought, well, can that process of isolation that instigated diversity, well, the case that was the evolution of iguanas in the Galapagos Islands, that they evolve very differently through isolation, not through mixing with each other. So I thought, well, if that's what gave us all the species in the world, can isolation also instill diversity in ideas. So I thought, what if instead of going from Melbourne to Sydney, which I used to do frequently back then, by plane or sending an email, or I actually incubated an idea for the time that it took me to walk from Melbourne to Sydney. So that was pretty much what started this amazing journey to incubate an idea in isolation for whatever time. I didn't know it was going to take me 42 days. It happened to be 42 days, but whatever time it took me to go walk from Melbourne to Sydney, which was around 905 kilometers.
Yeah, I mean, also 42 is a number that means a lot to me personally. For me, it's a reference to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and it has changed my life. But I think this idea of incubating an idea in isolation is quite countercultural, in the sense that a lot of the time we are told that creativity and innovation comes from human connection, from serendipity, from friction, etc. And I think to me, that's also why it was so important to have this discussion, because of course we're all about, at Cosmic Centers, we always say that we're here to enable human collaboration, but that doesn't mean that it has to be continuous and the only way that we innovate or change, like bring in our creativity. And I think at the same time that I first met you and you were sharing that with me, Google also had released some research from their own internal teams that actually showed that teams that had daily stand-ups were less likely to innovate than teams that didn't. And I thought that was such an interesting insight, because, we know, like, we were always told, for innovation, you need weak and strong ties. You need collaboration, but you also need isolation. And I think that's what your story brings so beautifully as a point. So, okay, so you do this walk, you're incubating an idea, and on the way you learn lessons, right? And you call these lessons in your book signposts. And in fact, a big chunk of your book is kind of orchestrated around these signposts. Tell us what are signposts in your own words, but also maybe some of the most significant ones. I know it's hard to pick a favorite amongst your children, but maybe there's a couple you like more than others.
Yeah, so to follow the analogy of a walk, of a pilgrimage, I frame my lessons as signposts because I think those lessons point to a better place to work. At the end of the day, that's what I was hoping to find, a better place to work. And I think these 34 signposts that came up point there. As you've anticipated, it's very hard to choose one or two or a few of them. But if I could select some of them, one would be, the first one was that perhaps we exchange ideas too early and too often. So that's a signpost that tells us that perhaps we should sit with idea for a bit longer until it matures. It has its own DNA. I'm not saying never share your idea, just give it enough time for it to evolve. The second one, and this is a bit controversial just to put it out there because it needs a little bit of explanation, but I think that the workplace should promote absurdity. Allow ourselves to explore things that it's not based on logic. And the reason I say this, it's a process why I say this and explain the book, but I think that the future of work will, at least our relevance in it, will be what is uniquely human. And as algorithms are better at replacing our logic mindset, what will remain is our ability to be absurd, our ability to entertain two propositions that cannot simultaneously be true, like a metal bird flying, and then we have the airplane. So this type of absurdities that at one point were ridiculous, but they deliver better futures. So that's another one. And the other one perhaps will be, the third one, is that we should revisit the idea or our relationship with adversities. I'm an architect and designers. We use design to iron out all the adversities from the environment. And through my experience walking to Sydney, you can imagine the amount of adversities that I face. But because of them is that I learned quite an important lesson. So I think it's well recognized that we grow and innovate through adversities. But when it comes to work and workplace environment, we try to take them out. So those will be three of them.
I love that. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the first as a kind of introduction to this discussion. I want to deep dive into the other two around absurdity and adversity. Talk to us, holding two paradoxical thoughts in our minds at the same time is one way that you defined it, but can you explain further what you mean by absurdity?
So yeah, absurdity, that's what I refer to, something that is absurd. If I tell you, going back to the example, imagine thing made out of metal that flies and we can go from one continent to the other. Before that existed, you'll say, well, that's crazy. Or a technology that allowed to see someone in Dubai and in Australia and have a conference streamed to the world. That is absurd before it exists. So this idea, that's where a lot of the innovation that we do or strive to is linear, trying to do what we currently do, cheaper and faster. The type of innovation I'm talking about is disruptive. It's a little bit about people wanting faster horses instead of a plane or a car.
Yeah, I understand that. And so how would you like if I took that concept and try to say, well, how would you apply that in the workplace?
So an important thing about the signpost is that it's a process of reflection. It's not that I was walking on my way to Sydney and I was seeing signposts popping up, and this is an important distinction to make because I initially, even though the signposts are the core, the strength of the book, they can be misleading because we don't go through life and then something pops up saying that's a lesson there. It's only comes through reflection. That's why if that process does not exist, the signpost never arise. Took me 2 years. The walk took me 42 days. Coming to the signpost, digesting that took me 2 years. So that gives you an idea of the depth and of the thinking that is required to achieve these lessons. But then another important factor is, okay, I realize through this process that we should explore the absurd, right? What does that mean? So while I was chasing this signpost, I got to the edge of it. What does it mean the workplace should promote absurdity? For months, I tried to find this place and I couldn't find a way out. And that's when I thought that it was enough time for my set of ideas, unique ideas, to be incubated in isolation. And I needed it to release my idea and bring experts. And in this process, that's when I start getting some more answers. So one of them comes from the researcher in organization design, in which we talk about the idea of absurdity. And he pointed me to a study or to opinion piece actually called the technology of foolishness from James March. So he puts forward foolishness as a technology that will allow us to imagine better innovation, which is uncanny to what I was trying to do. But again, his technology is not very plug and play. It's not something that he doesn't really explain how you can fit it into an organization. Because let's face it, the way we design the workplace as a physical environment, but also how it works, is a temple to rationality. Even though that might be our human trait to be absurd, we still design processes and environment as a temple where we worship rationality and void of absurdity. But the closest that I've been able to frame how absurdity could work in the workplace is to venture into it temporarily. I explore other environments that can also allow us to explore absurdity, like carnivals. Carnivals, they inverse reality. The king dressed like a peasant and the peasant like a king, but it's always temporarily. So explore the absurd and very temporarily, and then a very long process of that has to be coordination and delivery, and that has to be completely void of absurdity, because the book what followed was trying to communicate as clearly as possible the absurdity of walking from Melbourne to Sydney to incubate an idea. But once you're writing, I need to be able to establish a very clear dialogue. There's no room for misunderstanding. Once I have already conceived and observed idea, I need to convey it clearly as possible.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So what you're saying is you can create short bursts of absurdity, whether by shifting environments, changing realities, whatever it is. And then once you feel like that's given you something that you feel strongly about as an idea, then you go back into quote unquote production mode, and just making things happen. And so your 42 days to the 2-year process that it then took you to actually write and birth the book is kind of that comparison. In your chapter No Pain No Gain, you also talk about that adversity piece, and how it was essential actually to you discovering the signposts. I wonder again if you could tell us a little bit more. I mean, both you and I are immigrants, right? And there's a lot said actually about the capacity for immigrants to lead, create companies, create value, innovate, accept absurdity, because in fact the comparison even between where I am today and my home country is absurd, right? Like to be able to hold these two realities together in my mind is already a process. But also to the level of adversity that we're able to deal with, like we've heard a lot about that, so maybe also it comes from our personal experiences that this sounds very familiar. But I wonder if you can talk further towards that adversity piece. And again, I mean, is it that adversity is created by the environment, but we should embrace it? Or are you saying that we should ourselves design either work processes or workplaces that create that adversity?
So obviously, when I planned my walk, I tried to weed out all adversity. I mean, who will design or incorporate adversity, even though pilgrimage? And so I make the distinction between a walk and a pilgrimage, because what I want to focus is not about the physical distance that I cover between Melbourne and Sydney, but the pilgrimage, which are the lessons that come out of it. And pretty much every single pilgrimage have a set of rules of how the walk should be covered. And most of them, if not all, are to instill adversity into it. There's some that you actually need to do like prostrations, like burpees, for long distance, so that suffering is part of the process. There's a saying that, well, some people aim to be safe from pain, others want to be safe through pain. So, and Nietzsche reminds us of the importance of risk and adversity in a society, and perhaps by trying to weed out this, striving for more risk adverse societies, we're creating a human that is apathetic. Men and women are apathetic, have lost all dreams and hopes. So we have that body of knowledge, if you wish, and I make a review in the book about the importance of adversity in leading to innovation. But as we're saying before, a design aims to reduce that, and not only that, but we ourselves, we are hardwired to avoid it. So I also did I call it mapping, because the beautiful thing about knowledge is that despite it being invisible, it can be mapped. So I mapped our knowledge that we have on adversity. I'm trying to find a diagram that here. Oh, you cannot see it because I have. So that is, I mean, people can just see it, I guess, in the book. But it is page. It's page number 128.
Okay.
So the beauty about that is that I map our understanding of adversity, how it travels in an organization, and found very quickly two environments. Adversity can travel in intangible environments, and usually organizational culture, and can travel in tangible environments. And that's what we deal with in design, like temperature, illumination, things like that. fascinating. And those that have access to that page, by the way, the book is free to download, so you can have a quick look now if you wanted. You will see that the region of adversity in intangible environments is a lot bigger. People researching this area have higher curiosity in management of how we can use adversity to innovate. There's an area called scarcity that organizational slack. So what they're trying to do initially was, the assumption was that organizations that have a lot of resources, a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of people were better positioned to innovate. So they have a lot of organizational slack. But then they start doing research and they find out that organizations that actually have very low slack, they're more creative in how they use it, because if you don't have enough time, money, and resources, then you're more creative about how do you use them. So now the understanding is that organizations with too much slack don't innovate, and innovations with zero slack, no ability, don't innovate either. So it's a little bit in the sweet spot of organizational slack. So there's a lot of papers that I came across in the adversity in intangible environments. Adversity, and there's a paper that positioned adversity and collaboration side to side to predict scientific innovation. In architecture and design, we don't ask those questions. We strive to weed out adversity and continuously have the frictionless workplace. And I think that there's perhaps also an opportunity to reintroduce friction, adversity, as a way to benefit from it.
Yeah, I love that. Actually, there's a parallel to it in macroeconomics in a way, which is called the curse of resources. So when you look at countries that have access to natural resources, oil, whatever, in fact, they are less likely to be able to build sustainable economies, and they usually have very short-lived, as long as they can sell whatever resource they have, then they're fine, but they actually don't innovate in terms of building more sustainable future for the country. So I see a lot of parallel there with those use cases. And again, I mean, my personal experience as an immigrant, and we've seen a lot of these stories, and most of the big companies in the US are built by immigrants as well. There's plenty of coverage of that. I think it comes from that too, right? Like I used to joke in my first job, we had development teams in Lebanon and development teams in Canada. And it was very interesting to observe actually how differently the two teams coded. I think if we went back to the code and if we found it and downloaded it, it would be fascinating. Because in Lebanon, now it's gotten even worse, but at least when we grew up, it was the case that sometimes you wouldn't have gas to cook things or water to shower or whatever it is. So you had to deal with adversity all the time. Unlike Canada, where if you lost electricity once for 6 hours, everything would stop, right? So like you were much better in Lebanon at like just finding patches, finding small solutions that allowed you to kind of progress, which wasn't the case at all in Canada. And when I talked to the developers in the two countries, they had a big misunderstanding of each other, because actually the Lebanese were much better at solving the problems, but they solved them in unsustainable ways, right? And then the Canadians were much better at, or those who lived in Canada, were much better at creating like long-term technical debt-free content, but it took them forever. And so it was always interesting to kind of see that comparison and how adversity, led people to think in different ways. I think it's a really fascinating topic, and one that for me feels very personal almost. But you're talking also about how, we rid the workplace of adversity. But you and I have also discussed a lot, the role of design, the role of architect in this process. I never ended up being an architect, but I studied architecture, as I often share here. And in fact, one of the reasons why I left architecture was that I felt the burden of responsibility too big, in the sense that I knew that I wasn't designing a space, I was designing a life, and in very immutable ways. That's why I shifted to the internet, because on the internet, you publish a website, it's not working, no problem, you can publish a new version. Somehow that felt more freeing. But when I was an architect, I felt like, what if I design the wrong space? Then I'm going to be impacting the lives of these people forever. And I felt, as a young, 21-year-old, I felt the burden of that responsibility very strongly. And so you talk about designing the work before designing the workplace. And I wonder again if you could tell us more about this and about the role of really architects and designers in facilitating that. Because truthfully, if we look at the evolution of architecture through time, architecture is a representation of, the what is important to society at that moment, right? If it's good architecture, then it tells much more than a story of space. So talk to us about this designing the work before designing the workplace.
So by the time the assumption of what work is hit us as architects or designers, it already has a lot of problems in it, embedded in it, that could be solved at a higher level. And also begs the ask for the opportunity to increase the value of design. One of the comments I make in the book is that design based, this is on the CEO of IDEO, Tim Brown, that says that design has been a downstream process in which architects or designers come and beautify an idea that someone already has. But what will happen and the type of value that we can deliver as designers if we have a say into what that idea is? And to illustrate a little bit of the thinking behind this, I realized that during my walk, again, people can see some pictures in the book, I was walking with two backpacks, a hat, walking sticks. I actually was conveying the look of someone that it's, an adventurer. I wasn't dressed like a civilian. And that play a role into the interactions that I have with people. If I went to a petrol station to buy a coffee or something, people will notice that and say, well, what are you doing? And this and that. And they will open to me with their hopes and dreams and what they wanted to do in ways that I have never experienced before or since. So it occurred to me that it was the way I looked that facilitated those type of conversations. So how can we understand the aesthetic of work if someone that is following their dreams and invite others to follow their dreams? What is the aesthetic of work? And then how we can harness it so that the organization has better conversations with their employees and with their clients. And let's face it, and this is an opportunity as a reminder for us not to confuse good design with good taste, because those that will see my pictures, there's no good taste in how I look. But it was good design in the sense that it transferred the activity that I was doing with purpose and alignment and honesty that allowed me to have this conversation. So if we're able to design work first, capture that aesthetic, and then use the physical environment to convey it, it will be for the betterment of the organization and the conversations it has with employees and clients.
Yeah, I love that. I love the don't mix up good taste and good design. I actually always say this to my team. We design something, and actually I tell them that a lot of the best websites and user experiences in the world, because now that's my reference point, are actually really ugly. Like if you think about Amazon, for example, it's not in good taste at all, but it works precisely because of that, in fact. And since we're talking about good taste and good design, there's a question from the audience. It takes us a step back into adversity, but I think we should still ask it because it's truly interesting. The question is, how do we make the distinction between good adversity and bad adversity to foster creativity and innovative thinking? Is there even such a distinction?
Yes, and that's one of the biggest chapters in the book is exploring that. It's very complex because what is it adversity? Is it me poking my teammate next to me, trying to make things difficult or trying to put attacks or spikes in people's chair? I think the good adversity is the one with purpose that leads to innovation, not the one that hinders. which ones are there, creates that. That's the exploration in the book. The ones that I have found within the workplace is they come from a theory that is called man-environment interaction. So what it argues is that a person is usually in adaptation with environment. So when you start looking at the environment, it's when you're in adaptation with it, the environment becomes normal. And that's what you want in a way, because imagine if the environment changes all the time, you always need to be in constant awareness. But once that happens, then you are in constant relationship with your environment. But if that environment changes and increases the demand that it asks from you, just enough for you to be able to match it, because if the environment asks more demand from you and you cannot satisfy it, then it breaks you. So to that person question is, you need to match the adversity with the ability of the person to overcome it. Otherwise, it won't work. It will backfire. But it's that play of increasing the demand, matching that with increased cognitive or physical performance, and continue doing that. There's a quote that I mentioned from Peter Eisman, an architect, that says that the architecture that we remember is not that comfort us, but the one that challenges us and make us feel uncomfortable. So it's a very complex question. It's a great question, but if I may also add to that, because people that read the book might be left with the impression that I'm advocating for environments that are absurd, isolated, and adverse. The point that I'm trying to make here, and those who were in workplace design or remember this from 2015 or thereabouts, there was this debate about the sit to stand polemic. I don't know if you remember that. Sitting was portrayed as the new smoking, right? So people start working sitting up and these new workstations. And then we realized that actually this standing up for a long time can have equally detrimental side effects. So the recommendation then evolved not to be sitting down or standing up, but the best position is the next one. So if you're sitting up, sit down. If you sit down, stand up. So always alternates. So the same principle is the one that I'm advocating in this book. So if we stay in the same logic-based mode, we miss the opportunity to be absurd. If we stay always comfortable, we miss on the opportunity to be uncomfortable. So continuously changing the mode so we can benefit. The other one that another signpost is boredom. Boredom as a thinking tool.
Please stop asking my next questions for me.
Oh,
no, go for it. I was going to ask you about boredom next.
So boredom, you can imagine how bored I was, because I have two rules. Again, I frame this as a pilgrimage. So I have two rules. No doing it in isolation. So that's why I was carrying two backpacks, because no one was supporting me or anything like that. I have to be self-sufficient. And the second is no music or podcasts or audiobooks. So I could be with my own thoughts for the duration that it took me to get there. And as you can imagine, by day number 3, after taking some selfies, and the experience started to get a bit boring. So I was bored beyond belief. And I was actually very tempted to go back and, say, what's the point of this? I'm so bored that I cannot even think. But once you pass that threshold, you get to explore and benefit from boredom and reach to a thinking place that is very difficult to achieve otherwise. Am I putting forward the idea that the workplace should be boring? Yes, but not all the time. So going back to which one is the best? Is it wowing people with amazing digital waterfalls and all the experience that we create in the workplace? Yes, but also allowed people to go to the next and the next and have this alternative environment.
Look, I fully appreciate that. Actually, kind of umbrella idea, if you will. At least that's how I'm seeing it now. This is the first time we talk about the next position is the best position. So I'm discovering it. It's not like a discussion we've had in the past. And I find that perhaps to be the most interesting way to look at all of these things. Because at first, when it's if someone's looking at this and they're a very rational person, they're like, okay, Augustine, this is cute, but like adversity, boredom, whatever, isolation, like, what do you want me to do with all of this, right? And I think this is, and I know that, and rightfully so, you are resistant to this idea of saying like, how do I take this and apply it, but also people want to know that, like they want to think through with you, how do you take this and apply it, even though of course the idea is to give them these ideas for them to go and incubate and then figure out how to apply them, so they should themselves repeat the pilgrimage in metaphorically. But I think this idea of like designing the next experience is interesting to me, and I want to explore it with you for a minute, right? Because as a leader, I'll take that for myself with my own team. Of course, I want rationality because it leads to predictable outcomes, right? Like I know that I have trained my people, and now when I give them something, it's ready in 1 day or 2 days or 5 days, and I can start to, as you say, innovate by incremental improvements to our process, to our way of working, to our frameworks, but it's not disruptive. But at the same time, of course, I also want everybody in my team to be able to be the master of their own creativity. I don't want them to be the executors of mine, right? As a CEO, I also need to create space for myself to go and be in those different environments, quote unquote, both physical and kind of mental ones, because that's where I get my best ideas. For example, I always say, I will, it's been 2 years that in the summer I go west. I call it Cosmic West. But I leave my day-to-day comfort. The first year I went to Mexico. The second year, this year, I went to Montreal. Time zones are different. There's adversity in the way that we work. I have more time to think, like things shift and they transform. And so it creates space. But I feel like this notion of the next thing is the best thing is really interesting to me. And I wonder if you could give, perhaps, I know, again, advice or your thoughts to leaders on how they can be intentional about that. Like, how would you practically have somebody, at least without giving them solutions, but what's the process to make sure you keep thinking about it?
Absolutely. The purpose of this book is to be applied. So it's not about, it kind of sets signposts of, I think, where we should go, but not metaphorically, actually, to actually go to that place, which I believe is a better place to work. How do we get there? And it's not about, so we talk about absurdity, we talk about adversity and boredom, and it's not that you follow one signpost and it takes you somewhere, and then you follow another one and it takes you somewhere else. If the signposts are true, they can only converge in one place, a better place to work. So it's only by following one that eventually you'll end up in that destination. So the idea of switching and how you can do it is that allowing that opportunity to occur. One of the comments I make in the book is our relationship that we used to have with madness. This is from a book of Civilization and Madness that I make a brief comment there, in which the author tells us that we used to have a common language with the madmen. Because they used to hold, or we believe they have knowledge about the edge of the world. That person that is crazy is that person that has a view of the edge of the world. But in this new era, we have lost that common language. And we're seeing in more hardcore, more recently, management books, we are starting to reclaim. There's a new book coming out more recently called The Management of Absurd and the Paradoxes. And now we're starting to recognize that perhaps the competitive advantage of organizations will be how they can harness these absurdities and navigate there. The worst thing that we can do is pretend that it doesn't exist. So we might as well embrace it. So going to this double mode, go from absurd to deliver. In the conversations with the people that interview for the book, they argue that just uh, rule of thumb,
Yeah. Rule
rule
of
of thumb,
thumb. Yeah.
yeah, 10% absurdity, 90% coordination, void of all absurdity. So you have that glimpse that gives you that idea of what is absurd, and then spend all that 90%, as I did, 42 days walking to Sydney, and 2 years trying to convey that.
I love that.
The adversity, the same with boredom. Have that switch between standing and sitting down, and yeah.
I think that's great advice. And now you're making me think like my month and a half in summer is my 10%. So there you go. It works for me too. In fact, this whole conference concept of the 3 weeks was a moment of absurdity where I was like, wait a minute, why do we need to make a conference over one day? People aren't traveling for this one. It was that I had to step away from my desk in order to come up with that idea. I mean, whether it's successful or not, we will think about as we retrospect in a couple of weeks, but it was definitely there that it started. You're also making me think about a book. I don't know if you've ever read it. It's an Arthur C. Clarke book called The City and the Stars. I don't know if I've ever mentioned it to you in one of our conversations, about this idea of the madman. So essentially, the way the story is set up is there's a city called Diaspar. It's kind of like, as far as the inhabitants are concerned, it's the last city on earth. And the way that this city kind of sustains itself is there's a mega computer that decides who is born. But people aren't born, they're actually downloaded back from the memories of previous humans. And the computer is constantly keeping society in balance in terms of the types of personalities that they introduce into society. Except as we go through the book, I mean, spoiler alert, but not really, we discover that every once in a while, the computer kind of throws into the mix a madman, the equivalent of what you called a madman. So someone who actually breaks things, someone who ruins the process, who creates opportunities for disruption. And the computer knows that without that, society will go into decline. Right? So actually, it's very interesting because you're making me think of that story. Even though when Arthur C. Clarke wrote it, he was talking about his philosophical argument was not this one, but you're still making me think about that specific moment, because it's, humans always strive for comfort, right? That's kind of that's why we build increasingly comfortable places to live, services, like I live in the most comfortable city on earth, probably. I don't even have to go out to buy anything. I could sit right here and everything would be delivered to me. I live in absolute comfort. But then there is very little space for me to innovate in this comfortable environment. So adversity, I totally relate to this idea of adversity at least being important, but then having the ability to execute. Because if I go into an adverse environment for too long, then I can't focus on the long-term thinking. So I really find that a very beautiful way to think about it as a leader. And this is also what I love about our conversations, is that in some sense they are adverse because they put forward thoughts that are uncomfortable. Right? It's a
And
lot more comfortable as a leader to be like, okay, great, we're going to fix our processes, we're going to get better, and that's really, to me, the gist of it.
so if I can, where does this signpost lead? This is a question. I think they point to a better place to work, but how do we get there? And they need an economy for them to thrive. How does the actual CEO they implement it? And the best way that I have to explain this is the one thing that I learned very early on in this experience, while I was walking actually, was something that I didn't know before I started doing the walk. And that was that, I don't know if it's common in other countries, but as I was walking, I saw these signs on the road that says horse poo for sale. So they actually sell horse manure, horse poo for $2, right? So they have bags and then you can buy it. And I think people use them for their gardens, as for them to put them in the gardens and so on. Anyway, that was an interesting novelty. But as some people might know, you need to cross Victoria. Melbourne is in Victoria. Then you cross another state, which is New South Wales, and that's where Sydney is. And there's always this argument that Sydney is more expensive than Melbourne in Victoria. And now I have empirical data that that's the case, because the moment I crossed states, the horse poo was $3. So it was $1 more expensive than in Victoria. And as I mentioned before, I was bored beyond belief, right? So what do you do when you're bored beyond belief? You start thinking silly things. And one of them was, what if I become a poo merchant, right? So I thought, I can become a millionaire. I can actually become a millionaire if I move 1 million bags of horse poo from Victoria to New South Wales. And because I'll be walking for 10 hours a day, I'll do the mental calculations because I didn't have much to do. And I realized that it will take me around 3,000 years to move 1 million, because they're heavy, so I needed to put them in my backpack and all this and that. So 3,000 years. But with that realization, it came that it's easier to understand and develop a business plan to sell shit and become a millionaire than to implement the lessons of the signposts. So I don't think that the problem is how you commercialize this, because you can commercialize shit. It's how you create an economy that is supportive of the lessons of the signposts. So until you not operate in that economy, that market, it will be hard to make them implement.
I love that. We're going to quote you. Next year, we're going to post like a quote from Augustine, Cosmic Conference 2023. It's easier to sell shit. I love that. Augustine, with that, I feel very inspired this morning, and I know our audience does too. Thank you so much for creating that space for us actually to think in those terms and to be able to hold paradox true in our minds for a minute. But we have come to the end of our time together, and I want to take us to our rapid fire questions before we wrap up for the day. So if you're ready, I'll take you through our statements. All right, so I'm going to start a statement and I want you to finish it. The first one is, great employee experience is?
Enhances purpose.
Beautiful. The second one is, the book every leader should read today, besides yours?
The Pilgrim's Guide to the Workplace.
Actually, you really should read it. And if you don't like reading, it's also available as an audiobook in English and in Spanish. So no excuses. This covers most of the world. It's an incredible book, and I think it's a book better read slowly. I think it's better to read it one chapter at a time and stop, because otherwise you lose the signposts, like then you might to follow one.
It's also very short, though. It's very, very short.
It is. That's the thing, though. You could read it in 2 hours, but my advice is to read it in 2 months. Like, read a chapter and leave it be for 2 days and let it incubate in your mind before you get to the next signpost, so that you have time to truly digest all of them and think about them. The ideal workplace is?
One that nurtures our competitive advantages of humans.
Beautiful. And the secret ingredient to a great employee experience is?
Alignment with the design of the organization. So it's a continuity.
Yes. Thank you for that. I feel we should have an entire other session about employee experience being aligned with the business side of the organization. Maybe we shall organize that soon. All right. Well, Agustin, thanks again for an inspiring conversation. I was really glad that you joined us today, and I really enjoyed this conversation. And of course, a big thank you to our audience for tuning in, asking us good questions. And of course, the video is available on LinkedIn. It's going to be available on our website and YouTube in a few minutes. So if you ever want to come back and watch it or share it with somebody, you know where to find it. And then just before we leave you, our next conference session is happening tomorrow at 6 p.m. Dubai time. I'm going to be joined by Professor Connie Hadley, who's the founder of Institute for Life at Work and a professor of organizational psychology. And if any of you have been spammed by me or any of the centaurs over the last few weeks to answer a survey, Tomorrow, the results are going to be discussed by myself and Connie. We wanted to understand the influence that human connection at work can have on job meaning and satisfaction. And so, no spoiler alerts. If you want to learn what we've learned, then join us tomorrow, 6 p.m. Dubai time, for the readout, essentially, of the preliminary results of the survey. I think that, that's our contribution to this great discussion on the Great Resignation and the crisis of trust in organizations. Everything I talked about is, of course, available on our conference website, cosmiccentersconference.com. If you need any information, want to rewatch any of our sessions or want to share them, that's where you'll find it. Gus, once again, thanks so much, and I'm signing us out.
Thank you very much.